Welcome back. Let's get back to the story. In Chapter 11, Signals from the Ship. Now, so soon it was clearly light, we went, all of us, into the leeward brow of the hill to stare upon the derelict, which now we had cause to believe was no derelict, but an inhabited vessel. Yet through we watched for upwards of 2 hours, we could discover no sign of life or any living creature, in which, indeed, had we been in cooler minds, we had not thought strange, seeing that she was all so shut in by the great superstructure. But hard to see a fellow creature after so much loneliness and terror in a strange lands and seas. And so we cannot by any means contain ourselves in impatience till those aboard the hulk could choose to discover themselves to us. And so, at last, we wearied with watching, and made it up together to shout when the bosun gave us the signal, by this means making a good volume of sound which we conceived the wind might carry down to the vessel. Yet, though we raised many shouts, making it seem to us a very great noise, there came no response from the ship. And at last we were bade to cease our calling, and ponder some other way of bringing ourselves to the notice of those within the hulk. For a while we talked, some proposing one thing and some another, but none of them seeming to achieve our purpose. And after that we fell to our marveling that the fire which had lit in the valley had not awakened them to the fact that some of their fellow creatures were upon the island. For had it, we could not suppose but that they would have kept a perpetual watch upon the island until such time as they could have been able to attract our notice. Nay, more than this, it was scarce credible that they should not have made an answering fire, or set some other bunting above the superstructure, that our gaze should be arrested upon the instant we chanced to glance towards the hulk. But so far from this, there appeared to even be a purpose to shun our attention, for that light which we had viewed in the past night was more in the way of accident than that nature of a purposeful exhibition. And so, presently, we went to breakfast, eating heartily. Our night of wakefulness had given us mighty appetites. But for all that, we were so engrossed in the mystery of the lonesome craft that I doubt if any of us knew what manner of food it was which filled our bellies. For the first one view of the matter would be raised, and when this had been combated, another would be broached. And in this wise it came off. Finally, some of the men were falling in doubt whether the ship was inhabited by anything human, saying rather that it might be held by some demonic creature of the great weed continent. At this proposition there came among us a very uncomfortable silence, for not only did it chill the warmth of our hopes, but it seemed like to provide us with a fresh horror whose we're already acquainted with too much. Then the bosun spoke, laughing with a hearty contempt at our sudden fears. and pointed out that it was just as light aboard that they aboard the ship had been put in fear by the great blaze from the valley, and that they should take it for a sign that fellow creatures and friends were at hand. For as he put it to us, who of us could say what fell brutes and demons the weed continent did hold? And if we had reason to know that there were very dread things among the weed, how much the more must they, who had, for all that we knew, had been many years beset as sound by such. And so he went on to make it clear. We might suppose they're very well aware that some creatures to the island. Yet, maybe, they desired not to make themselves known until they've given sight to them, and because of this, we must wait until they choose to discover themselves to us. Now, when the bosun made an end, we felt each one of us greatly cheered, for his discourse seemed very reasonable. Yet there were many matters that troubled our company. For, as one put it, was it not mightily strange that we had not had previous night of their light, or in the day of smoke from their galley of fire? But to this the bosun replied that our camp hitherto had lain on a place where we had not sight even the great world of weed, leaving alone any view of the derelict, and more, that at such times we had crossed to the opposite beach. We had been occupied too sincerely to have much thought to watch the hulk, which, indeed, from the position showed only the great superstructure. Therefore, further, that until the preceding day, we had once climbed to any height, and from that our present gate the derelict could not be viewed, and to do so, we had to go near the leeward edge of the top hilltop. And so, after breakfast being ended, we went, all of us, to see if there was yet any signs of life in the hulk. But when an hour had gone, we were now wiser. Therefore, being a folly to waste any further time, the bosun left one man to watch the brow of the hill, charging him very strictly to keep in such position as to be seen by any aboard the silent craft, and so took the rest down to assist him in repairing the boat. And from thence on, during the day, he gave the men a turn each at watching, telling them to wave to him should there come any sign from the hulk. Yet, expecting the watch, he kept every man so busy as might be, some bringing weed to keep up a fire which had lit near the boat, and one to help him turn and hold the batten upon which he labored, and two sent across to the wreck of the mast to detach one of the footlock shrouds which, as it most rare, were made of iron rods. This, when they brought it, he bade me to heat in the fire, and afterwards beat out straight at one end, and when this was done, set me to burn holes with it through the keel of the boat, and such places as he marked, these being for the bolts in which he had determined to fasten the batten. And meanwhile, he continued to shape the batten until it was a very good and true fit, according to his liking. And all the while he cried out to this man, to that one, to do this or that. And so I perceived that, apart from the necessity of getting the boat into seaworthy condition, he was desirous to keep the men busied, for they became so excited with the thought of fellow creatures almost within hail, that he could not hope to keep them sufficiently in hand without some matter upon which to employ them. It must not be supposed that the bosun had no share of excitement. for I noticed that he gave ever anon a glance to the crown of the far hill. Perchance the watchman had some news for us. Yet the morning went by, and no signal came to tell us that the people in the ship had designed to show themselves to the man upon the watch. And so we came to dinner. At this meal, as might supposed, we had a second discussion upon the strangeness of the behavior of those aboard the hulk, yet none could give any more reasonable explanation than the bosun had given in the morning, and so we left it at that. Presently, when we had smoked and rested very comfortably, for the bosun was no tyrant, we rose at his bidding to descend once more to the beach. But at this moment, one of the men, having run to the edge of the hill to take a short look at the hulk, cried out that the part of the great structure over the quarter had been removed or pushed back, and that there was a figure there, seeming, so far as unaided sight could tell, to be looking through a spyglass at the island. Now, it would have been difficult to tell if all our excitement at this news, and we ran eagerly to see ourselves if it could be as he informed us. And so it was, for we could see the person very clearly, though remote and small because of the distance that he had seen us. We discovered it in a moment, for he began suddenly to wave something which I judged to be the spyglass in a very wild manner, seeming also to be jumping up and down. Yet I doubt not but that we were as much excited, for suddenly I discovered myself to be shouting with the most insane fashion, and moreover, I was waving my hands and running to and fro upon the brow of the hill. And then I observed the figure on the hulk had disappeared, but it was for more than a moment. And then it was back, and there were near to a dozen with it, and it seemed to me that some of them were females, but the distance was so great over for surety. Now these, all of them, seeming us upon the brow of the hill, must have shown up plain against the sky, began at once to wave in a frantic way. We replied like in manner, shouted ourselves hoarse with vain greetings, but soon we grew wearied of the unsatisfactoriness of this method of showing our excitement, and one took a piece of the square canvas and let it stream out in the wind, waving it to them. And another took a second piece, and did likewise, while the third man rolled up a short bit into a cone and made use of it as a speaking trumpet, though I doubt if his voice carried any further because of it. For my part, I seized one of the long bamboo-like reeds which were laying near the fire, and with this I was making a very brave show, and so it made me see how great and genuine our exultation upon our discovery these poor people shut off from the world within that lonesome craft. And then suddenly it seemed to come to us and realize that they were among the weed, and we upon the hilltop, and we had no means of bridging that lay between. And at this, we faced another with to discuss what we should do and the effect of rescuing those within the hull. There was little that we could even suggest, even for though one spoke of how he had seen a rope cast by means of motor to a ship that lay offshore. Yet this helped us not, for we had no motor, but here the same man cried out that they and the ship might have such a thing, so that they would be able to shoot the rope to us. And at this we thought more upon having his saying, for if they had such a weapon, then might our difficulties be solved. Yet we were greatly at loss to know how we should discover whether they possessed of one, and further to explain our design to them. But here the bosun came to our help and bade one man to go quickly and char up some fresh of the reeds in the fire. Whilst this was doing, he spread out upon the rock one of the spare lengths of canvas. Then he sung out to the man to bring him one of the pieces of charred reed, and with this he wrote in our question upon the canvas, calling for fresh charcoal as he required it. Then, having made an end of writing, he bade two of the men to take hold of the canvas by ends and expose it to the view of those in the ship, and in this matter we got them to understand our desires. For presently some of them went away and came back after a little and held up for us to see a very great square of white, and upon it a great No. And at this we were again at our wits' ends to know how it would be possible to rescue those within the ship. For suddenly our whole desire to leave the island was changing into determination to rescue people in the home. And, indeed, had our intentions not been such, we had been veritable curs, though I am happy to tell that we had no thought at this juncture but for those who were now looking to us to restore them once more to the world which they had been so long strangers. Now, as I have said, we were again at our wits' ends to know how to come to those within the hulk, and there we stood, all of us, talking together. Perchance we should hit upon some plan, and anon we could turn and wave to those who watched us so anxiously. Yet a while passed, and we had come no nearer to a method of rescue, and a thought came to me. Waked perchance by the mention of shooting the rope over to the hulk by means of motor. How that I once read in a book of a fair maid who never effected her escape by castle by the similar artifice. Only that in his case he made use of the bow in place of a motor, and a cord instead of a rope. His sweetheart hauling him up by rope hauling up the rope by means of the cord. Now, it seemed to be a possible thing to substitute a bow for the motor, but only could find the material in which to make such a weapon. And with this in view, I took up one of the lengths of bamboo like reed and tried the spring of it, which I found to be very good. For this curious growth of which I had spoken hitherto as a reed had no resemblance to that plant, beyond its appearance, being extraordinarily tough and woody, and having considerably more nature than a bamboo. Now, having tried the spring of it, I went over the tent and cut a piece of this sap spleen which I found among the gear, and with this in the reed I contrived a rough bow, and then I looked about till I came upon a very young and slender reed, which I had been cut with the rest, and from this I fashioned some sort of arrow, feathering it with a piece of one of the broad, stiff leaves which grew upon the plant. And after that I went forth to the crowd, leering at the leeward edge of the hill. And now, when they saw me thus armed, they seemed to think I intended a jest, and some of them laughed, conceiving that it was a very odd action on my part. But when I explained that which was on my mind, they ceased from laughter and shook their heads, making that I did but waste time. For, as they said, nothing save gunpowder covers so great a distance. And after that they turned again to the bosom, to whom some of them seemed to be in argument. And so for a little space I held my peace and listened. Thus I discovered certain men navigating the taking of the boat so soon as it was sufficiently repaired, and making a passage through the weed to the ship, which they proposed to do by cutting a narrow canal. But the boatswain shook his head and reminded them of the great devilfish and crabs, and the worst things which the weed concealed, save that those in the ship would have done it long since it had been possible, and that the men were silenced, being robbed of their unreasoning endure by his warnings. Now, At this point, there happened a thing which proved the wisdom which the bosun contended, for suddenly one of the men cried out for us to look, and that we turned quickly and saw that there was a great commotion among those who were in the open place in the superstructure, for they were running this way and that, and some were pushing us to the side which filled the opening. Uh-oh. And then immediately we saw the reason for their agitation and haste, for there was a stir in the weed near to the stem of the ship. In the next instant, monstrous tentacles were reaching out to the place where had been the opening, but the door was shut and those aboard the hulk in safety. At this manifestation, the men about me were proposed to make use of the boat, and the others also cried out their horror of the vast creature, and I am convinced, had the rescue depended upon the use of the boat, then those in the hulk been forever doomed. Now, conceiving that this was a good point at which they would renew my importunities, I began once again to explain the probabilities of our plan succeeding, addressing myself more particularly to the bosun, who told how that I had read that the ancients made mighty weapons, some which could throw great stones so heavy as 2 men over the distance surprising a quarter of a mile. Moreover, that they compassed huge headballs which threw a lance or great arrow even further. On this he expressed much surprise, never have hearing of the like, but doubted greatly that we should be able to construct such a weapon. Yet I told him I was prepared, for I had the plan of one clearly in my mind, and further I pointed out to him that we had the wind in our favor, and that we are great height, which would allow the air to travel farther before it came to a low as the weed. And then I stepped on the edge of the hill, and bidding him to watch, fitted my arrow in the string, and having but the bow loosened it, whereupon, being aided by the wind on the height of which I stood, the arrow plunged into the weed at a distance of near 200 yards from where we stood, that being a quarter mile the distance on the road to the derelict. At that, the bosun was won over by my idea, but though, as he remarked, the arrow would follow near, had it been drawn a length of yarn after it, and to this I asserted, but pointed out that my bow and arrow was a rough affair, and more. I was no archer, yet I promised him, with the bow, I should make the cast a shaft clean over the hook. Did he but give me his assistance, and bid the men to hell. Now, as I come to regard it in the light of the greater knowledge, my promise was exceedingly rash, but I had faith in my conception, and I was very eager to put it to the test, the which, after much discussion at supper, it was decided I should be allowed to do. Chapter 12. The Making of the Great Bow. The fourth night upon the island was the first to pass without incident. It is true that the light shone from the hulk out into the weed, but now that we had made some acquaintance with her inmates, it is no longer cause for excitement so much as contemplation. As for the valley where the vile things had made the end a job, it was very silent and desolate under the moonlight, for I made the point to go and view it during my time on watch. Yet, for all that it lay empty, it was very eerie, and a place to conjure up uncomfortable thoughts, so that I spent no great time pondering it. This was the second night on watch that we had been free from the terror of the devil things, and it seemed to me that the great fire had put them in fear of us and driven them away. But of the truth or error of this idea, I was to learn later. Now, I must be admitted that, apart from the short look into the valley and occasional starings at the light out of the weed, I gave little attention aught to my plans for the great bow, and to such use did I put my time, that when I was relieved, I had either particular and detail worked out, so that I knew very well just what to set the men doing so soon as we should make a start in the morning. Presently, when the morning had come and we made an end of breakfast, we turned to upon the great bow, the bosun directing the men under my supervision. Now, the first matter to which I bend attention was the raising to the top of the hill the remaining of half of the portion of the topmast which was not split in twain to produce the batten for the boat. To this end we went down, all of us, to the beach where lay the wreckage, and getting about to the portion which I intended to use, carried it to the foot of the hill. Then we sent a man to the top to let down a rope by which we moored the boat to the sea anchor, and when we had bent this on securely to the piece of timber, we returned to the hilltop and tailed on the rope, and so, presently after much willful pulling, had it up. The next thing I desired was that the split face of the timber should be rubbed straight, and this the bosun understood to do, and whilst he was about it I went, with some of the men, to the grove of reeds, and here, with great care, I made selection of some of the finest, these being for the bow, and after I cut some which were very clean and straight, intending them for the great arrows. With these we returned once more to the camp, and there I set to and trimmed them of their leaves, keeping these latter, for I had use of them. Then I took a dozen reeds and cut them each to length of 25 feet, and afterwards I notched them for the strings. In the meanwhile, I had sent 2 men down to the wreckage of the mast to cut away a couple of the hempen shrouds and bring them to the camp, and they appearing about this time, I set to work to unlay the shrouds, so that they might get out of the fine white yarns which lay beneath the outer covering of tar and blacking. These, when they come to them, we found to be very good and sound. And this being so, I bid them to make 3 yarns sinnet, meaning for the strings of the bows. Now, it will be observed that I had make said bows, and this I will explain. It had been my original intention to make one great bow, lashing dozens of the reeds together for the purpose. But this, upon pondering, I conceived to be but a poor plan, for there would be much light and power lost in the rendering of each of these pieces through the lashings, when the bow was released to obviate this. Albeit this, and further to compass the bending of the bow, which had at first been a source of puzzlement to me how it was going to be accomplished, I had determined to make 12 separate bows, and these I intended to fashion at one end of the stalk above one other, so that they were all in one plane vertically, and because of this conception I should be able to bend the bows at one time, and slip each string over the catch notch, and afterwards wrap 12 strings together in the middle part so there should be but one string in the butt of the arrow. All this I explained to the bosun, who indeed had exercised in his mind as to how we should be able to bend such a bow I intended to make, and he was mightily pleased with my method of evading this difficulty, and also one other which else had been greater than the bending, and that was the stringing of the bow, which would have proved a very awkward work. Presently the bosun called out that he had got the surface of the stalk sufficiently smooth and nice, and at that I went over to him, For now I wished him to burn a slight groove down the center, running from end to end. And this I desired to be done very exactly, for upon it depended much of the true flight of the arrow. Then I went back to my own work, for I had not yet finished notching the bows. Presently, when I had made an end of this, I called for the length of the sinnet, and with the aid of another man, contrived to string one of the bows. This, when I had finished, I found to be very springy, and so stiff to bend that I had all that I could manage to do so. And at this I felt very satisfied. Presently, it occurred to me that I should go do well to set some of the men to work upon the line which the arrow was to carry, for I determined that this should be made also from the white hemp yarns, and for the sake of lightness, I conceived that one thickness of yarn would be sufficient, but so that it might compass enough strength, I bid them split the yarns and lay two halves up together, and in this manner they made a very light and sound line, though it must not be supposed that it was finished at once, for I needed over a half-mile of it, and thus it was later finished, and then the bow itself. Having gotten all things in train, I sat down to work upon one of the arrows, for I was anxious to see what sort of a fist I should make of them, knowing how much I should depend upon the balance and the truth of the missile. In the end, I made a very fair one, feathering with its own leaves and turning and smoothing it with my knife, after which I inserted a small bolt in the fore end to act as a head, and as I conceived gave it balance, though through the weather I was right in this latter. I am not unable to say, yet before I had finished my arrow, the bosun had made the groove. He called me over to him, that I might admire it, which I did, for it was done with the wondrous neatness. Now, I have been so busy with my description of how we made the great bow that I have omitted to tell of the night of time, and how we had eaten dinner this long while since, and how that the people in the bulk waved to us, and we returned to the signals. Then written upon our length of the canvas had one word, wait, and besides all this had some gathered our fuel for the coming night. And so presently the evening came upon us, but we ceased not to work, for the bosun bade the men to light a second great fire beside our former one, and by the light of this we worked another long spell, though it seemed short enough by reason of the interest of the work. Yet at last the bosun bade us to stop and make supper, which we did, and after that he set the watches, and the rest of us turned in, for we were very weary. In spite of the previous weariness, then when the man whom I relieved called to take my watch, I felt very fresh and wide awake. I spent a great part of the time on the preceding night in studying over my plans for completing the great bow, and it was then that I decided finally in the manner of I should secure the bows athwart at the end of the stock. For until then I had been a little doubt on being divided between several methods. Now, however, I concluded to make 12 grooves across the sawn end of the stock, and fit in the middles of the bows into these, one above the other, as I have already mentioned, and then to lash them at each side to bolts driven in the sides of the stock. And with this idea I was very well pleased, for I promised to make them secure, and with this without any great amount of work. Now, though I spent much of my watching thinking over the details of my prodigious weapon, yet I must not be supposed that I neglected to perform my duty as a watchman, for I walked continually about the hill, top of the hill, keeping my cut and thrust ready for any sudden emergency. Yet my time passed off quietly enough. Though it is true that I witnessed one thing which brought me a short spell of disquiet thought, and it was in this wise. I had come to the part of the hilltop which was overhung the valley, and it came to me abruptly to go near to the edge and look over. Thus, the moon being very bright, and the desolation of the valley reasonably clear to the eye, it appeared to me, as I looked over, I saw movement among the certain fungi which had not burnt, but stood up shriveled and blackened in the valley. Yet by no means could I be sure that it was not a sudden fancy, born of the eeriness of that desolate-looking vale. Moreover, as I like to be deceived, I was like to be deceived by the uncertainty which the light of the moon gives. Yet to prove my doubts, I went back until I found a piece of rock easy to throw. In this, taking a short run, I cast into the valley, aiming at the spot where it seemed to me that there had been movement. Immediately upon this, I got a glimpse of some moving thing, and then, more to my right, something else stirred. And at this, I looked towards it, but I could discover nothing. And then, looking back at the clump which I had aimed my missile, I saw that a slime-covered pool which lay near was all a quiver, or so it seemed. Yet the next instant I was full of doubt, for even as I watched it, I perceived that it was quite still. And after that, for some time, I took a very strict gaze into the valley. I could nowhere discover aught to prove my suspicion. And at last I ceased from watching it, for I feared to grow fanciful, and so wandered to that part of the hill which overlooked the weed. Presently, when I had been relieved, I returned to sleep, and so to the morning. Then, when we had made each of us hasty breakfast, were all grown mightily keen to see the great bow completed, we set to upon it, each at our appointed task. Thus the bosun and I had made it our work to make the 12 grooves athwart in the flat end of the stock, to which I proposed to fit the lash of the bows. This was accomplished by the means of iron foot-ox shroud, which we heated in the middle part, and then each taking an end, protected our hands with canvas. We went on each side and applied the iron until at length we had the grooves burnt out very nicely and accurately. This work was occupied us all morning, for the grooves had to be deeply burnt, and in the meantime the men had completed near enough sennit for the stringing of the bows. Those who were at work on the line which the arrow was to carry had scarce made more than half a mile. So I called off one man from the senate to turn to and give them a hand with the making of the line. When dinner was ended, the bosun and I set about fitting the bows into the places, which we did, and lashed them to 24 bolts, 12 a side, driven into the timber of the stock, or 12 inches from the end. After this we bent and strung the bows, making very great care to have each bent exactly as the one would allow it. We started at the bottom, and so, therefore, before sunset, we had that part of our work ended. Now, because of the 2 fires we had lit on the previous night, we had exhausted our fuel, and the bosun deemed it prudent to cease work. They all go down, all of us, to bring a fresh supply of the dry seaweed and some bundles of the reeds. This we did, making an end of our journeying just as the dusk came over the island. Then, having made a second fire, as on the preceding night, we first had our supper, and after that another spell of work, all the men turning to upon the line which the arrow was to carry, whilst the bosun and I set each of us upon the making of a fresh arrow. for that I realized that we should have to make 1 or 2 flights before we could hope to find our range and make true our aim. Later, about 9 of the night, the bosun bade us all to put away our work, and then he had set watches, after which the rest of us went to the tent to sleep, for the strength of the wind made the shelter a very pleasant thing. That night, when it came to my turn to watch, I minded me to take a look into the valley, what though I watched at the intervals through half of an hour, I saw nothing to lead me to imagine that I indeed seen aught on the previous night. And so I felt more confident in my mind that we should trouble no further by the devil things which had destroyed poor Job. Yet I must record one thing which I saw during my watch, though this was from the edge of the hilltop which overlooked the weed continent, and was not in a valley, but in the stretch of clear water which lay between the island and the weed. As I saw it seemed to me that a number of giant fish were swimming across the island, diagonally towards the great continent of weed, where they were swimming in one wake, and keeping a very regular line, but not breaking the water after the manner of the porpoises or blackfish. Yet, though I mention this, it must not be supposed that I saw any very strange thing in such a sight, and indeed I thought nothing more of it to wonder what sort of fish they might be, and I saw them indistinctly in the moonlight. They made a queer appearance, seeming each of them to be possessed of 2 tails, and brother, I could have thought I perceived a flicker as one of the tentacles just beneath the surface, but this I was no means sure. Upon the following morning, having heard our breakfast, each of us to set again upon our tasks, for we were in hopes to have the great bow at work before dinner. Soon the bosun had finished his arrow, and mine was completed very shortly after, so that there was left nothing now for the completion of our work, save the finishing of the line, and getting of the bow into position. This latter I assisted by the men we produced now to effect making of a level bed of rocks near the edge of the hill which overlooked the weed. Upon this we placed the great bow, and then having it sent the men back to do the work at the line, we proceeded to the aiming of the huge weapon. Now, when we have gotten the instrument pointed, as we conceived straight over the hulk, which we accomplished by squinting along the groove which the bosun had broke down the center of the stock, we turned upon the arranging the notch and trigger, the notch being to hold the strings when the weapon was set, and the trigger a board bolted on loosely on the side just below the notch, to push them upwards out of this place when we desired to discharge the bow. This part of the work took up no great portion of our time, and we had already for the first flight. Then we commenced to set the bows, mending the bottom one first, and then those above in turn, until all were set. Then after that we laid the arrow very carefully in the groove. Then I took 2 pieces of the spun yarn and wrapped the strings together at the end of the notch, and thus, by this means I assured that all the strings would act in unison when striking the butt of the arrow. And so, we had all things ready for the discharge, whereupon I placed my foot upon the trigger, and bidding the bosun to watch carefully the flight of the arrow, pushed downwards. The next instant, with a mighty twang, and a quiver made the great stock stir in the bed of rocks, the bow sprang to its lesser tension, hurling the arrow outwards up towards the vast arc. Now it may be conceived that in mortal interest, for we watched its flight, and so in a minute discovered that we aimed too much to the right, where the arrow struck the weed ahead of the hook. But beyond it, at that, I was filled near to bursting with pride and joy, and the men who had come forward to witness the trial shouted to acclaim with my excess, whilst the bosun clapped me twice upon the shoulder to signify his regard, and shouted as loud as any. It now seemed to me that we had but get the true aim, and get the rescue of those in the hulk would be another matter of another day or two, for having once gotten a line to the hulk, we should haul across the thin rope by its means, and with this a thicker one, and after which we should set this up taut as possible, and bring the people in the bulk by the island by the means of a seat and block which we should haul to and fro along the supporting line. Now, having realized that the bow would indeed carry so far as the wreck, we made haste to try our second arrow, and at this time we bade the men to go back to the work upon the line, for we should have need of it in a very little while. Presently, having pointed the bow more to the left, I took upon the frappings of the strings, so that the bow singly, and after that we set to the great weapon again. Then, seeing that the arrow was straight in the groove, I replaced the frappings and immediately discharged it. This time, to my very great pleasure and pride, the arrow went with a wonderful straightness towards the ship, and clearing the superstructure passed out of our sight as it fell behind. At this, I was all impatient to try and get the line to the hulk before we made our dinner, but the men had not yet laid up sufficient, there being only 450 fathoms, which the bosun measured off by stretching it along his arms across his chest. This being so, we went to dinner and made very great haste through it, and after that every one of us worked the line, and so in about an hour we had sufficient, for I had estimated that it would not be wise to make an attempt with less length than 500 fathoms. Having now completed a sufficiency of the line, the bosun set out of the men to flag down very carefully upon the rock beside the bow, whilst he himself tested it all at such parts as he thought in any way doubtful. And so presently all was ready. Then I bent it on to the arrow, having set the bow whilst the men were flaking down the line. I was prepared immediately to discharge the weapon. Now, all the morning, a man upon the hulk had observed through a spyglass from our position that brought his head just above the edge of the superstructure, and being aware of our attention, having watched the previous flights, he understood the bosun, and he beckoned to him that we had made ready for a third shot, and so, with entering a wave of his spyglass, he disappeared from our sight, and that, having first turned to see that we're all clear of the line, I pressed down on the trigger fast and thick, and so the moment the arrow was sped, but now doubtless because of the wind. At this I can near have wept in the vexation and disappointment. Upon the failure of my shot, the bosun called to the men to haul in the line, and very carefully, so lack of weight in the missile which caused it to fall short. At that I felt much more hopeful, and turned at once to prepare a new arrow, the bosun doing likewise, though in his case he intended to make a lighter one than that which had failed, for, as he put it, though a heavy one fell short, yet might the lighter succeed, and if neither, then we could only suppose that the bow lacked power to carry the line, and in that case we should have to try some other method. Now, in about 2 hours I had made the arrow, the bosun having finished his little earlier, and so, the men having hauled in the line and flaked it down already, We prepared to make another attempt to cast it over the hull. Yet a second time we failed, and by so much it seemed hopeless to think of success. But for all that appeared useless, the bosun assisted on making one last try with the light arrow. And presently, when we had gotten the line ready again, we loosed it upon the wreck. But in this case, so lamentable was our failure that I cried out to the bosun set the useless thing above the fire and burn it, for I was sorely irked by the failure, and could scarce abide to speak civilly of it. Now the bosun, perceiving how I felt, sung out that we would cease troubling about the hull for the present, and go down all of us to gather reeds for the fire. For it was drawing nigh to evening, and this we did, though all in a disconsolate condition of mind, for we had seemed so near to success, and now it appeared to be further than ever from us. And so, in a while, having brought up sufficiently food, the bosun sent 2 of the men down the ledges which overhung the sea, and bade them see whether or not I could secure fish for our supper. Then, taking our place about the fire, we fell to upon the discussion of the hull. Now, for a while there came no suggestion worthy notice, until there occurred to me a notable idea, and I called out suddenly that we should make a small fire balloon, and float off the line to them by such means. At that the men about the fire were silent for a moment, for the idea was new to them, and moreover they needed to comprehend what I meant. Then they had come fully at it. The one who had proposed that they should make spears of their knives cried out to know why a kite would not do, and at that I was confounded, and that so simple an expedient had not occurred to any before, for surely it would be so but little matter to put a line to them by means of a kite. And further, such a thing would take no great making. And so, after a space of talk, it was decided upon the morrow we should build some sort of kite, and with it lie a line over to the hull, which stood to be a task of no great difficulty, with so good a breeze as we had continually with us. And presently 2 fishermen had caught whilst we talked. The bosun said to the watchers, and the